Several of our colleagues sent an extraordinary brief to the Supreme Court threatening political retribution if the justices did not decide a case the way they wanted. We've seen proposals to turn the FEC, the regulator of elections and political speech, into a partisan body for the first time ever. All these things, Mr. President, all these things, a toxic temptation to stop debating policy within our great American governing traditions and instead declare a war on the traditions themselves. A war on the traditions themselves. So, colleagues, whatever policy differences we may have, we should all agree this is precisely the kind of recklessness the Senate was created to stop. The response to losing one election cannot be to attack the office of the presidency. The response to losing several elections cannot be to threaten the Electoral College. The response to losing a court case cannot be to threaten the judiciary. The response to losing a vote cannot be to threaten the Senate. We simply cannot let factional fever break our institutions. It must work the other way, as Madison and Hamilton intended. The institutions must break the fever, rather than the other way around. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. The framers built the Senate to keep temporary rage from doing permanent damage to our republic. That, Mr. President, is what we will do when we end this precedent-breaking impeachment. I hope we will look back on this vote and say, this was the day the fever began to break. I hope we will not say, this was just the beginning. I ask unanimous consent the Senate stand in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Without objection, the Senate stands in recess subject to the call of the chair.
Good afternoon from Washington, everybody. This is Fox News coverage of the Senate impeachment trial vote. I'm Martha McCallum.
And I'm Brett Baer. We are just minutes away from the Senate formally voting to return a verdict in President Trump's impeachment trial.
Senators will cast two votes, one for each article of impeachment. The first, abuse of power. The second, obstruction of justice.
This is guilty or not guilty?
Obstruction of Congress, excuse me. Obstruction of Congress.
Guilty or not guilty? For a look at how this will all play out, let's turn to congressional correspondent Chad Pergram on Capitol Hill. Good afternoon, Chad.
Good afternoon. For only the third time in U.S. history, the United States Senate will vote to determine the guilt or innocence of a U.S. president. There have been a total of 20 impeachments in U.S. history of various officials, 8 convictions and removals. That will not happen today. It takes 67 votes. In just the past couple of moments, we've got news that Joe Manchin, Democratic senator from West Virginia, he will vote to convict. Also, Kyrsten Sinema, the Democratic senator from Arizona, she will vote to convict as well. Here are the mechanics. When they come back into session, they will go through each article of impeachment. The senators will be called alphabetically. They will rise from their desks and vote guilty, not guilty. Then they will tabulate. Again, it takes 67 votes. If you go back to 1999 with President Clinton, there were 45 guilty votes on one article of impeachment, 50 on the other. This is the most consequential vote for a U.S. senator in their career. And it's an election year. This is the most consequential vote of this year. The Capitol is still buzzing about the news regarding Mitt Romney, the Republican from Utah, indicating that he would vote to convict on one article. I spoke just a few minutes ago with Adam Schiff, the lead impeachment manager, about Mitt Romney's decision, and he told me, quote, that showed great moral courage. Brett and Martha, back to you.
All right, Chad, thank you. As we wait for the final votes, let's bring in our panel. Chris Wallace is the anchor of Fox News Sunday. Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner, and Molly Hemingway, senior editor at the Federalist. Chris, your interview with Mitt Romney made quite a stir up here in Washington.
It did. It was very dramatic. We were asked yesterday, would we like to do the only television interview with the senator? They didn't say outright, but it became pretty clear he was going to vote to convict on at least one of the two articles. We sat down about 11:30 this morning with the embargo until after he formally announced it. What struck me was that it turned very serious very fast, and that the gravity of his decision and the real torment, if you will, that he went through. He said he hadn't slept past 4 a.m. for weeks, that he really didn't want to have to take this vote, that he pleaded with the White House to give him some affidavits, some more information, so that he would be able to find a way around this vote. But he said in the end, his conscience, his faith, this is the only decision he could make, to vote to convict on the abuse of power.
Chris, let's play a short clip from that interview if we can.
You realize this is war. Donald Trump will never forgive you for this.
There's a hymn that is sung in my church. It's an old Protestant hymn, which is, do what is right, let the consequence follow. I know in my heart that I'm doing what's right. I understand there's going to be enormous consequence, and I don't have a choice in that regard. That's why I haven't been anxious to be in the position I'm in. When I heard there was going to be an impeachment investigation, as I heard the evidence that was coming forward, I dreaded the responsibility I'd have. But I was not willing to abdicate the responsibility given to me by the Constitution, nor to ignore my conscience out of personal and political significance. I mean, considerations. I mean, I had to follow my conscience.
All right, and here we go. Let's go to the House of Representatives, where they're beginning
Senate
this
floor.
proclamation.
John Trump, President of the United States. As a reminder to everyone in the chamber, as well as those in the galleries, demonstrations of approval or disapproval are prohibited.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, the Senate is now ready to vote on the articles of impeachment, and after that is done, we will adjourn the court of impeachment.
The clerk will now read the first article of impeachment.
Article 1, Abuse of Power. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives, quote, shall have the sole power of impeachment, unquote, and that the President, quote, shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors, close quote. In his conduct of the office of President of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States, and to the best of his ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in that, using the powers of his office, President Trump solicited the interference of a foreign government, Ukraine, in the 2020 United States presidential election. He did so through a scheme or course of conduct that included soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his re-election, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump also sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit. In doing so, President Trump used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. He thus ignored and injured the interests of the nation. President Trump engaged in this scheme or course of conduct through the following means. 1. President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within and outside the United States government, corruptly solicited the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations into a political opponent, former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., and B, a discredited theory promoted by Russia alleging that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 United States presidential election. 2, with the same corrupt motives, President Trump, acting both directly and through his agents within the outside of the United States government, conditioned 2 official acts on the public announcements that he had requested. A, the release of $391 million of United States taxpayer funds that Congress had appropriated on a bipartisan basis for the purpose of providing vital military and security assistance to Ukraine to oppose Russian aggression, and which President Trump had ordered suspended. And B, a head of state meeting at the White House, which the President of Ukraine sought to demonstrate continued United States support for the government of Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression. 3, faced with the public revelation of his actions, President Trump ultimately released the military and security assistance to the government of Ukraine and has persisted in openly and corruptly urging and soliciting Ukraine to undertake investigations for his personal political benefit. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections. In all of this, President Trump abused the powers of the presidency by ignoring and injuring national security and other vital national interests to obtain an improper personal political benefit. He has also betrayed the nation by abusing his high office to enlist a foreign power in corrupting democratic elections. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Each senator, when his or her name is called, will stand in his or her place and vote guilty or not guilty as required by Rule 23 of the Senate Rules on Impeachment. Article 1, Section 3, Clause 6 of the Constitution regarding the vote required for conviction on impeachment provides that no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. The question is on the first article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? A roll call vote is required. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Mr. Alexander, not guilty. Ms. Baldwin.
Guilty.
Ms. Baldwin, guilty. Mr. Barrasso.
Not guilty.
Mr. Barrasso, not guilty. Mr. Bennett.
Guilty.
Mr. Bennett, guilty. Mrs. Blackburn.
Not guilty.
Mrs. Blackburn, not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal.
Guilty.
Mr. Blumenthal, guilty. Mr. Blunt.
Not guilty.
Mr. Blunt, not guilty. Mr. Booker.
Guilty.
Mr. Booker, guilty. Mr. Bozeman.
Not guilty.
Mr. Bozeman, not guilty. Mr. Braun.
Not guilty.
Mr. Braun, not guilty. Mr. Brown.
Guilty.
Mr. Brown, guilty. Mr. Burr.
Not guilty.
Mr. Burr, not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, guilty. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Cardin, guilty. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, guilty. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, guilty. Mr. Cassidy.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cassidy, not guilty. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, not guilty. Mr. Coons.
Guilty.
Mr. Coons, guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Ms. Cortez Masto, guilty. Mr. Cotton.
Not guilty.
Mr. Cotton, not guilty. Mr. Kramer.
Not guilty.
Mr. Kramer, not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Crapo, not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, not guilty. Mr. Daines.
Not guilty.
Mr. Daines, Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth, guilty. Mr. Durbin? Mr. Durbin, guilty. Mr. Enzi? Mr. Enzi, not guilty. Ms. Ernst? Ms. Ernst, not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein? Mrs. Feinstein, guilty. Mrs. Fisher? Mrs. Fisher, not guilty. Mr. Gardner? Mr. Gardner, not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mrs. Gillibrand, guilty. Mr. Graham? Mr. Graham, not guilty. Mr. Grassley? Mr. Grassley, not guilty. Ms. Harris? Ms. Harris, guilty. Ms. Hassan? Ms. Hassan, guilty. Mr. Hawley? Mr. Hawley, not guilty. Mr. Heinrich? Mr. Heinrich, guilty. Ms. Hirono? Ms. Hirono, guilty. Mr. Hoven? Mr. Hoven, not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith?
Not guilty.
Mrs. Hyde-Smith, not guilty. Mr. Inhofe?
Not guilty.
Mr. Inhofe, not guilty. Mr. Johnson?
Not guilty.
Mr. Johnson, not guilty. Mr. Jones?
Guilty.
Mr. Jones, guilty. Mr. Kane?
Guilty.
Mr. Kane, guilty. Mr. Kennedy?
Not guilty.
Mr. Kennedy, not guilty. Mr. King?
Guilty.
Mr. King, guilty. Ms. Klobuchar? Ms. Klobuchar, guilty. Mr. Langford? Mr. Langford, not guilty. Mr. Leahy? Mr. Leahy, guilty. Mr. Lee?
Not guilty.
Mr. Lee, not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler? Mrs. Loeffler, not guilty. Mr. Manchin?
Guilty.
Mr. Manchin, guilty. Mr. Markey?
Guilty.
Mr. Markey, guilty. Mr. McConnell?
Not guilty.
Mr. McConnell, not guilty. Ms. McSally? Ms. McSally, not guilty. Mr. Menendez?
Guilty.
Mr. Menendez, guilty. Mr. Merkley? Mr. Merkley, guilty. Mr. Moran?
Not guilty.
Mr. Moran, not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Ms. Murkowski, not guilty. Mr. Murphy?
Guilty.
Mr. Murphy, guilty. Mrs. Murray? Mrs. Murray, guilty. Mr. Paul?
Not guilty.
Mr. Paul, not guilty. Mr. Perdue?
Not guilty.
Mr. Perdue, not guilty. Mr. Peters?
Guilty.
Mr. Peters, guilty.
Not
Mr. Portman?
guilty.
Mr. Portman, not guilty. Mr. Reed?
Guilty.
Mr. Reed, guilty. Mr. Risch?
Not guilty.
Mr. Risch, not guilty. Mr. Roberts?
Not guilty.
Mr. Roberts, not guilty. Mr. Romney?
Guilty.
Mr. Romney, guilty. Ms. Rosen?
Guilty.
Ms. Rosen, guilty. Mr. Rounds?
Not guilty.
Mr. Rounds, not guilty. Mr. Rubio?
Not guilty.
Mr. Rubio, not guilty. Mr. Sanders?
Guilty.
Mr. Sanders, guilty. Mr. Sass? Mr. Sass, not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Mr. Schatz, guilty. Mr. Schumer? Mr. Schumer, guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida?
Not guilty.
Mr. Scott of Florida, not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Mr. Scott of South Carolina, not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Mrs. Shaheen, guilty. Mr. Shelby?
Not guilty.
Mr. Shelby, not guilty. Ms. Sinema?
Guilty.
Ms. Sinema, guilty. Ms. Smith?
Guilty.
Ms. Smith, guilty. Ms. Stabenow?
Guilty.
Ms. Stabenow, guilty. Mr. Sullivan?
Not guilty.
Mr. Sullivan, not guilty. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester, guilty. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, not guilty. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Tillis, not guilty. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, not guilty. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall, guilty. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, guilty. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, guilty. Ms. Warren.
Guilty.
Ms. Warren, guilty. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, guilty. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, not guilty. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, guilty. Mr. Young.
Not guilty.
Mr. Young, not guilty.
With that, 52 not guilty, 48 guilty. They do not get to 67, the two-thirds needed. So this is a vote to acquit the President of the United States on the first article of impeachment, abuse of power. The clerk will read out the numbers. The Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice John Roberts, will say the President is acquitted of Article 1, abuse of power, and they will move on to Article 2. This doesn't usually happen. Senators sitting at a desk, getting up, saying guilty, not guilty. You just saw one of the most powerful votes in the U.S. Senate a senator ever can make. And now Article 1 is acquittal. Listen in.
On this article of impeachment, 48 senators have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 52 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. Two-thirds of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that the respondent, Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the first article of impeachment. The clerk will read the second article of impeachment.
Article 2, obstruction of Congress. The Constitution provides that the House of Representatives shall have the sole power of impeachment and that the President shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. In his conduct of the office of the President of the United States and in violation of his constitutional oath faithfully to execute the office of President of the United States and, to the best of his ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States, and in violation of his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, Donald J. Trump has directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. President Trump has abused the powers of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution in that the House of Representatives has engaged in an impeachment inquiry focused on President Trump's corrupt solicitation of the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 United States presidential election. As part of this impeachment inquiry, the committee's undertaking the investigation serves subpoenas seeking documents and testimony deemed vital to the inquiry from various executive branch agencies and offices and current and former officials. In response, without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas. President Trump thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to the exercise of the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. President Trump abused the powers of his high office through the following means. 1, directing the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents sought therein by the committees. 2, directing other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, in response to which the Department of State, Office of Management and Budget, Department of Energy, and Department of Defense refused to produce a single document or record. 3, directing current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees, in response to which 9 administration officials defied subpoenas for testimony, namely John Michael Mick Mulvaney, Robert B. Blair, John A. Eisenberg, Michael Ellis, Kristen Wells Griffith, Russell T. Vaught, Michael Duffy, Brian McCormick, and T. Ulrich Breckbull. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections. Through these actions, President Trump sought to arrogate to himself the right to determine the propriety, scope, and nature of an impeachment inquiry into his own conduct, as well as the unilateral prerogative to deny any and all information to the House of Representatives in the exercise of its sole power of impeachment. In the history of the Republic, no president has ever ordered the complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry or sought to obstruct and impede so comprehensively the ability of the House of Representatives to investigate high crimes and misdemeanors. This abuse of office served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment, and thus to nullify a vital constitutional safeguard vested solely in the House of Representatives. In all of this, President Trump has acted in a manner contrary to his trust as president and subversive of the constitutional government, to the great prejudice of the cause of law and justice, and to the manifest injury of the people of the United States. Wherefore, President Trump, by such conduct, has demonstrated that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office, and has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance and the rule of law. President Trump thus warrants impeachment and trial, removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
The question is on the second article of impeachment. Senators, how say you? Is the respondent, Donald John Trump, guilty or not guilty? The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Ms. Baldwin. Guilty. Mr. Barrasso. Not guilty. Mr. Bennett. Guilty. Mrs. Blackburn.
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Blumenthal. Guilty. Mr. Blunt. Not guilty. Mr. Booker. Guilty. Mr. Bozeman. Not guilty. Mr. Braun. Not guilty. Mr. Brown. Guilty. Mr. Burr. Not guilty. Ms. Cantwell. Guilty. Mrs. Capito. Not guilty. Mr. Cardin. Guilty. Mr. Carper. Guilty. Mr. Casey. Guilty. Mr. Cassidy. Not guilty. Ms. Collins. Not guilty. Mr. Coons. Guilty. Mr. Cornyn. Not guilty. Ms. Cortez Masto. Guilty. Mr. Cotton. Not guilty. Mr. Kramer. Not guilty. Mr. Crapo. Not guilty. Mr. Cruz. Not guilty. Mr. Daines. Not guilty. Ms. Duckworth. Guilty. Mr. Durbin. Guilty. Mr. Enzi. Not guilty. Ms. Ernst? Not guilty. Mrs. Feinstein? Guilty. Mrs. Fisher? Not guilty. Mr. Gardner? Not guilty. Mrs. Gillibrand? Guilty. Mr. Graham? Not guilty. Mr. Grassley? Not guilty. Ms. Harris? Guilty. Ms. Hassan? Guilty. Mr. Hawley? Not guilty. Mr. Heinrich? Guilty. Ms. Hirono? Guilty. Mr. Hoven? Not guilty. Mrs. Hyde-Smith?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Inhofe? Not guilty. Mr. Johnson?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Jones? Guilty. Mr. Kane? Guilty. Mr. Kennedy?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. King? Guilty. Ms. Klobuchar? Guilty. Mr. Langford? Not guilty. Mr. Leahy? Guilty. Mr. Lee?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mrs. Loeffler? Not guilty. Mr. Manchin? Guilty. Mr. Markey? Guilty. Mr. McConnell? Not guilty. Ms. McSally? Not guilty. Mr. Menendez? Guilty. Mr. Merkley? Guilty. Mr. Moran? Not guilty. Ms. Murkowski? Not guilty. Mr. Murphy? Guilty. Mrs. Murray? Guilty. Mr. Paul?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Perdue? Not guilty. Mr. Peters? Guilty. Mr. Portman? Not guilty. Mr. Reed? Guilty. Mr. Risch?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Roberts? Not guilty. Mr. Romney?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Ms. Rosen? Guilty. Mr. Rounds? Not guilty. Mr. Rubio? Not guilty. Mr. Sanders? Guilty. Mr. Sass? Not guilty. Mr. Schatz? Guilty. Mr. Schumer? Guilty. Mr. Scott of Florida?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Scott of South Carolina? Not guilty. Mrs. Shaheen? Guilty. Mr. Shelby? Not guilty. Ms. Sinema? Guilty. Ms. Smith? Guilty. Ms. Stabenow? Guilty. Mr. Sullivan?
Not guilty.
Not guilty. Mr. Tester? Guilty. Mr. Thune? Not guilty. Mr. Tillis? Not guilty. Mr. Toomey? Not guilty. Mr. Udall? Guilty. Mr. Van Hollen? Guilty. Mr. Warner? Guilty. Ms. Warren? Guilty. Mr. Whitehouse? Guilty. Mr. Wicker? Not guilty. Mr. Wyden? Guilty. Mr. Young? Not guilty.
All right, and there you have it. On the second article of impeachment, obstruction of Congress, the vote is 47 guilty, 53 not guilty on that vote. As we watch this play out, obviously the obstruction of Congress charge was largely leveled at a lack of cooperation from the White House on witnesses that they wanted to bring in to be part of this investigation on the House side, and now the senators have stood at their desks and voted 57 to 43. 53 to 47 not guilty on the floor of the Senate in the case of Donald Trump. Let's listen to the Supreme Court justice.
Have pronounced Donald John Trump, President of the United States, guilty as charged. 53 senators have pronounced him not guilty as charged. 2/3 of the senators present not having pronounced him guilty, the Senate adjudges that respondent Donald John Trump, President of the United States, is not guilty as charged in the second article of impeachment. The presiding officer directs judgment to be entered in accordance with the judgment of the Senate as follows. The Senate, having tried Donald John Trump, President of the United States, upon 2 articles of impeachment exhibited against him by the House of Representatives, and 2/3 of the senators present not having found him guilty of the charges contained therein, it is therefore ordered and adjudged that the said Donald John Trump be, and he is hereby, acquitted of the charges in said articles.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
I send an order to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Ordered that the Secretary be directed to communicate to the Secretary of State, as provided by Rule 23 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, and also to the House of Representatives, the judgment of the Senate in the case of Donald John Trump, and transmit a certified copy of the judgment to each.
Without objection, the order will be entered.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Majority Leader is recognized.
Before this process fully concludes, I want to very quickly acknowledge a few of the people who helped the Senate fulfill our duty these past weeks. First and foremost, I know my colleagues join me in thanking Chief Justice Roberts for presiding over the Senate trial with a clear head, steady hand, and the forbearance that this rare occasion demands. We know full well that his presence as our presiding officer came in addition to, not instead of, his day job across the street. So the Senate thanks the Chief Justice and his staff who helped him perform this unique role. Like his predecessor, Chief Justice Rehnquist, the Senate will be awarding Chief Justice Roberts the Golden Gavel to commemorate his time presiding over this body. We typically award this to new senators after about 100 hours in the chair, but I think we can agree the Chief Justice has put in his due and then some. The page is delivering the gavel.
Thank you very much.
Of course, there are countless Senate professionals whose efforts were essential. I'll have more thorough thanks to offer next week to all of those teams, from the Secretary of the Senate's office to the parliamentarians, to the Sergeant at Arms team, and beyond. But there are 2 more groups I'd like to single out now. First, the 2 different classes of Senate pages who participated in this trial. Their footwork and cool under pressure literally kept the floor running. Our current class came on board right in the middle of the 3rd presidential impeachment trial in American history and quickly found themselves hand-delivering 180 question cards from senators' desks to the dais. No pressure, right, guys? So thank you all very much for your good work. And second, the fine men and women of the Capitol Police, we know that the safety of our democracy literally rests in their hands every single day. But the heightened measures surrounding the trial meant even more hours and even more work and even more vigilance. Thank you all very much for your service to this body and to the country.
The chair recognizes the Democratic leader.
I join the Republican leader in thanking the personnel who aided the Senate over the past several weeks. Capitol Police do an outstanding job day in, day out to protect the members of this chamber, their staffs, the press, and everyone who works in and visits this Capitol. They were asked to work extra shifts and in greater numbers to provide additional security over the past 3 weeks. Thank you to every one of them. I, too, would like to thank those wonderful pages. I so much enjoyed you with your serious faces walking down right here and giving the Chief Justice our questions. As the leader noted, the new class of pages started midway in this impeachment trial. When you take a new job, you're usually given a few days to take stock of things, get up to speed. This class was given no such leeway, but they stepped right in, didn't miss a beat, ferrying hundreds of questions from U.S. senators to the Chief Justice on national television is not how most of us spend our first week at work, but they did it with aplomb. I'd also like to extend my personal thank you to David Houck, the Director of the Office of Accessibility Services, Tyler Pumphrey, the Supervisor, and Grace Ridgway, the wonderful Director of Capitol Facilities. Everyone Grace's team worked so hard to make sure we were ready for impeachment. Gary Richardson, known affectionately to us as Tiny, the chief chamber attendant. Jim Hoover and the cabinet shop, who built new cabinets to deprive us of the use of our electronics and flip phones during the trial. Brenda Bird and her team did a spectacular job of keeping the Capitol clean, and Lyden Webb and his team moved the furniture and then moved it again and again and again. Grace, we appreciate all your hard work. Please convey our sincerest thanks to your staff. Thank you all, the whole staff, for your diligent work through many long days and late nights during this very trying time in our nation's history.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The chair also wishes to make a very brief statement. I would like to begin by thanking the Majority Leader and the Democratic Leader for their support as I attempted to carry out ill-defined responsibilities in an unfamiliar setting. They ensured that I had the wise counsel of the Senate itself through its secretary and her legislative staff. I am especially grateful to the parliamentarian and her deputy for their unfailing patience and keen insight. I am likewise grateful to the Sergeant-at-Arms and his staff for the assistance and many courtesies that they extended during my period of required residency. And thank you all for making my presence here as comfortable as possible. As I depart the chamber, I do so with an invitation to visit the court. By long tradition and in memory of the 135 years we sat in this building, we keep the front row of the gallery in our courtroom open for members of Congress who might want to drop by to see an argument or to escape one. I also depart with sincere good wishes as we carry out our common commitment to the Constitution through the distinct roles assigned to us by that charter. You have been generous hosts, and I look forward to seeing you again under happier circumstances. The chair recognizes the Majority Leader.
I move that the Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment on the articles against Donald John Trump, adjourn, sine die.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to. The Senate, sitting as a court of impeachment, stands adjourned, sine die.
And with that, the Senate impeachment trial is over. President Donald J. Trump will remain in office. He is now acquitted. That second vote, Mitt Romney voted not guilty on the second article of impeachment, changing the overall vote. But the bottom line is that this is over, and we are moving on. If you think about it, this all started 84 days ago, November 13th, 2019, with the first public House committee hearing, which we all brought you here on Fox News Channel. And now, 84 days later, it ends with the acquittal of President Trump. Let's bring in our panel. Chris Wallace is the anchor of Fox News Sunday. Byron York, chief political correspondent of the Washington Examiner.
And Molly Hemingway, senior editor at The Federalist. Chris, let me start with you. You know, it strikes me that it really began, at least in terms of what the public knowledge of it was, with that phone call in July between the President of the United States and President Zelensky. And that came just 24 hours after the Mueller chapter was closed. And so here we have tonight another chapter closing in terms of investigation of this president. And you have to wonder, you know, what comes next, and hope that we get a period of a bit of peace in some ways in terms of regular order.
Yeah, I want to talk about peace and regular order. I found the comments from the majority leader and the Democratic leader thanking the Pages and the Capitol Police and the Chief Justice and giving him a golden gavel oddly comforting, because it's the way things are supposed to work. Everybody acted gracefully and graciously. And it was such a contrast to what we saw last night in the State of the Union address. And you know, you do hope, exactly as you say, for some peace and quiet and regular order. Even newsmen, I think, are hoping for that. In terms of what we saw there with the roll call, you know, there was a gravity to it. You know, we knew what the result was going to be, but to hear the senators getting up, not saying ayes and nays, but saying guilty or not guilty as to whether or not the President of the United States should be removed from office, it's a pretty dramatic and grave moment. And as far as the political impact, I think you'd have to say that Donald Trump is better off now than he was when this impeachment process began. He's had a number of bipartisan successes on trade deals. The economy is rolling along. The Gallup poll just came out. It's the highest he's had in his presidency, 49%. But we can't forget it is a 50-50, bitterly divided nation. And as we saw last night with the speaker ripping up the President's State of the Union speech as he left, and the bitter divide over issues, maybe we'll get some peace and quiet, but this is going to be a tough, bitterly fought campaign.
Molly, despite everything, when the Chief Justice said he enjoyed that moment, even though it was a different place for him and he got the golden gavel, there was one question, obviously, from Senator Elizabeth Warren that questioned Chief Justice Roberts' impartiality. But besides that, he sat there over presiding, pretty much staying in the background as much as he could.
And that's kind of why I thought Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's remarks right before they began voting were so interesting. He began this process by saying that the Senate was made for times like this. He said he's clearly an Article 1 enthusiast. He believes that there's a reason why Congress is the first branch mentioned in the Constitution. And even beyond that, he's a Senate imperialist. He wanted people to know that as things are crazy elsewhere in the world, the Senate exists precisely to keep those fevers at bay. He had a line saying something like, institutions must break the fever rather than fevers breaking the institution. And he brought into that how people who were opposed to the results of the 2016 election weren't just going after President Trump, they'd also been threatening the courts and other institutions as well. I think that message really came through. We already knew that Donald Trump would not be removed from office. There was no way they were going to get as many Republicans as they needed to switch sides. I don't know if they knew that they were going to get a majority of senators to vote that Donald Trump was not guilty of either of the charges brought against him. So that was a little bit interesting to see that they were able to keep so many people together. But I think what Majority Leader McConnell wanted to do was show the beauty of the Senate, and I think he's probably pretty pleased with that.
Byron?
This has obviously been the subject of so much discussion over several months, a lot of speculation about what might happen, and now that it's over, we can conclude that some things just didn't happen. There was a lot of talk that some Republicans might break ranks with the president, and with the exception of one Republican senator on one count, Mitt Romney, on abuse of power. That just didn't happen. There was speculation that John Roberts would be more of an activist presiding officer in the Senate. Maybe he would order that witnesses be brought before the Senate. That didn't happen. He didn't do anything, really. He was basically modeling his performance on what Chief Justice Rehnquist did in the Bill Clinton trial in 1999. There was speculation the trial would stretch out for months and months and months. That didn't happen. It's over now. And finally, there was a speculation, including from me, that there would be a lot of surprises. Other than John Bolton, we didn't see a lot.
Thank you, panel. That concludes our special coverage of the Senate impeachment trial vote. I'm Martha McCallum in Washington.
And I'm Brett Baer. Please stay tuned to Fox News Channel and this Fox station for continuing coverage of this story. We're going to go now to Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who's at the microphones here on Fox News Channel. Let's listen to him.
Carefully over the years, our leadership positions have overlapped, and even before then, we were working together on appropriation bills back in the early days. I'm pretty sure she didn't want to do this. But the fact that she was pulled into this direction against what appeared to be her political instincts a year ago underscores that this was a purely political exercise. Now, having been dragged into something she instinctively felt was a mistake, then the second impulse was, let's get this over with as quickly as possible. Get it out of here, get it over in the other body, and let them deal with it. So that's why you had an abbreviated, truncated rush job over in the House. But even during that abbreviated period, it was pretty clear that they amassed a significant body of evidence from witnesses, which you heard them argue about over here frequently. They provided with us in the House record testimony from 13 witnesses, depositions from 17 witnesses. Then, of course, we added on top of that 180 questions. That we witnessed 193 witness video clips and 28,000 pages of evidence. So I asked my staff to count up the number of times we heard from the House managers during their presentation, how many times it was already proven. There were 60 times, 60, in which House managers said during their presentation to us that the case was either proven or proved. 60 times. There were 33 more times when one or more of the House managers said the evidence was overwhelming. So where did the nonsense about witnesses come from? I have a pretty good idea. After this thoroughly political exercise left the House and came over to the Senate, there was a lot of poll data taken. How are we going to sell this to senators? How are we going to sell it to the American people? Even though we already have all of this testimony and all of these witnesses, what polls well? Why, of course, if you ask the average citizen whether they think there ought to be witnesses in a trial, you're going to get an answer that you want. So the Speaker, I gathered, decided to sit on the impeachment papers after arguing that this is a matter of great urgency and the president needed to be removed from office as soon as possible. Sit on them for a month to laughably think that that somehow gave me leverage to concede their principal political argument, which was this was all about witnesses over here on our side. Well, that brought one of those rare smiles to my face, which you witnessed, in which I was perplexed by the strategy that was being employed. Finally, when it became obvious to everyone, it was an absurd position. Democratic senators were saying, why don't you send the papers over? Some of our own members were saying it before they got slapped back into line. The papers came over, and we knew full well this was all going to be about witnesses. I had said to my colleagues back in December in anticipation of the impeachment that their strategy would be to get it out of the House quickly and to leave it in the Senate endlessly, so that we'd have that wrapped around our axle indefinitely. And my suspicion was that it wasn't so much about President Trump, but rather about taking the Senate. And my counterpart, Senator Schumer, finally in the last few weeks pretty much admitted it to all of you that that's what this was all about. It was about taking the Senate and about trying to bog us down in this and to try to get my guys to have a lot of tough votes. So I'm proud of my colleagues for seeing through that, for knowing that even though if you ask a typical voter, should there be witnesses in a trial, they'd say, sure, of course there ought to be witnesses. That it was really about not the president, we all knew he was not going to be removed from office, but about trying to take the Senate. And so I'm proud of my members for resisting the temptation to go down that path, for also preventing what the second strategy was. It was pretty clear the Democrats, if they couldn't win this, wanted to embarrass the Chief Justice, try to drag him into this maelstrom. And the way that could have been done, obviously, was with a 50-50 vote where he would have been accused had he chosen not to rule, which, of course, I can't imagine he would have, but it's pretty clear that would have dragged the Supreme Court right into the middle of the maelstrom as well. So we've reached the conclusion. I think this was a thoroughly political exercise from the beginning to the end. And the final irony of it all is the Speaker was right in the beginning. Because here we are today in a position to judge the political impact of this. Since it all started about politics, how did it end about politics? The president has his highest approval rating since he's been in office. I can tell you as a poll watcher who's looking at polls in certain Senate races, every one of our people in tough races, every one of them, is in better shape today than they were before the impeachment trial started. So I'm not sitting here predicting what will be the biggest issue in November, but I can tell you this. Right now, this is a political loser for them. They initiated it. They thought this was a great idea. And at least for the short term, it has been a colossal political mistake.
Several of your members have been critical of the president's conduct, saying it was inappropriate or shameful, as Lisa Murkowski said. One of them, of course, today said he would vote to convict the president on abuse of power. Mitt Romney did. And for you, why is it okay for the president to ask another foreign country to investigate a political rival?
Now, Manu, I've been responding to you for years. And you know that what I'm here to talk about today is the political impact of this. We've completed it. We've listened to the arguments. We voted. It's in the rearview mirror. And I think what's appropriate now is to weigh, since it all began for political reason, the political impact of it. And I think it's pretty clear what I've already said is where we are right now. Yeah.
Is there room in the Republican Party for someone who votes for the president's conviction?
Well, I was surprised and disappointed, but I still think that we had a great teamwork on this. And I think we're in a good position going into our Senate races and the presidential race with regard to this issue. There may be plenty of other issues between now and November, but I think we're in pretty good shape right now. Yeah.
Leader McConnell, some of Speaker Pelosi's top lieutenants are already talking about next steps, subpoenaing John Bolton. Is there a serious political price to pay if they don't move on after impeachment?
Well, you know, I've watched these impeachments over these investigations over the years by both sides. I really think the American people are more likely to focus at this point and for the rest of the year on what kind of shape is the country in. How are you feeling about things? Are you better off, as President Reagan put it, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? Yeah, I think the investigations will go on. That's sort of what Congress does. We've done it when we were in the majority and there was a Democratic president. They've done it. I wouldn't expect that to stop. I think in the end, it's not likely to have much of an impact on any of the races, the presidential or the Senate races. Yeah.
Donald Trump Jr., just to follow up on Garrett's question there, is calling for Mitt Romney to be expelled from the Republican conference. Is there any chance that Mitt Romney is expelled from the Republican conference as a result of his vote to convict?
Yeah, look, I was surprised and disappointed, but we have much work to do for the American people. And I think Senator Romney has been largely supportive of most everything we've tried to accomplish.
Leader McConnell?
Yeah.
Why is there this reluctance to engage specifically?
All right, Mitch McConnell wrapping things up there in his news conference. In the beginning, he talked about Nancy Pelosi, how they've known and worked together for such a long time. He said that he believed that she went against her good political instincts in this situation, pursuing this impeachment, and that then she tried to rush it over to their chamber, pointing out what he sees as the political errors along the way that led to perhaps what we saw in this vote today, Brett.
We were wondering whether we would hear from the president today. We don't know, haven't heard anything specifically, but we just have seen a tweet in which the president tweeted a link to it looks like an ad, but it's Trump 2020, 2024, 2028, and goes on to Trump 2080.
Into infinity.
Into infinity. So that's the first reaction we have from the president of the United States to getting acquitted and to staying in office. Very quickly, a final thought, Chris.
Well, that does raise the one question, which is, can President Trump stand success? We've seen how tough and resilient he is in dealing with difficulty. But remember, the call to President Zelensky on July 25th was 24 hours after basically the whole Mueller case fell apart. So we'll have to wait and see how he does with success. You know, they say history is written by the winners. You saw Mitch McConnell. He says the president is at his highest rating ever. True in the Gallup poll. He says all the Republican senators seeking re-election are in better shape than they were before impeachment. And he said for Nancy Pelosi, she was right in the first case. Don't bring impeachment if there's not bipartisan sentiment, and it was a colossal mistake. That's probably the verdict as of today.
Byron?
Well, the question is what Democrats do next. I mean, they put so much faith in using investigations as the president. They spent 2 years hoping that the Russia investigation would result in an impeachment, only to see it fizzle out last summer. And a lot of Republicans breathed a sigh of relief at that time. And then by the time they woke up the next morning, it was all about Ukraine. Now that's come all the way to impeachment, and they have failed to remove the president there. So the question is, will they continue with these investigations through November, or just give up and basically try winning on policy?
Well, we have some points on the board here. You have a decision about the White House, former White House Chief of Staff, Don McGahn, whether he's going to testify. You have a Supreme Court decision on the taxes for the president at the end of March. So I would bet the latter if I were betting. Go ahead, Molly.
I don't think the resistance will stop. I think we've seen that there has been it doesn't matter what the issue is, they will keep going. And so it'll be interesting to see what the next thing will be. But at some point, I think people do have to deal with the reality that President Trump has come out of this stronger than he was before, that not only are his approval ratings as high as they've been in his presidency, it is the first time the Republican Party in general has had majority approval in a really long time. So.
We'll see.
You. Thank you, panel. So that concludes our special coverage of the Senate impeachment trial vote. I will see you tonight on The Story at 7 p.m. Eastern.
And I will have you covered at 6 p.m. We'll have complete coverage of today's historic events on Special Report. We have a full weekend ahead in New Hampshire. Remember that?
Indeed, we do.
And we might have Iowa, too. The 5 is next.
Hi, I'm Greg Gutfeld with Katie Pavlich, Juwan Williams, Jesse Waters, and a dragonfly is their jet ski. Dana Perino, the 5. Well, that's over with for now. So you've heard the definition of crazy, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. Well, the Democrats invented a new kind of crazy, knowing the outcome of an event well in advance and still expecting a different result. That's impeachment, the worst planned adventure since the Donner Party. The Dems blew all their energy on a loser's bet, one that made the Iowa mess possible. Instead of wowing America, they fell flat on their faces because they were distracted. I return to Greg's rule. Republicans run things, Democrats ruin them. The difference is one letter, which stands for impeachment. So once again, the losers return to their hallucinations. The snakes on the wall, they're real if you're Adam Schiff, because now Trump could offer Alaska to the Russians.
Trump could offer Alaska to the Russians in exchange for support in the next election.
Damn, Adam's so nutty, he farts trail mix. But hey, it beats moving to Mar-a-Lago.
Or decide to move to Mar-a-Lago permanently and let Jared Kushner run the country.
So why cling to these crazy predictions? Because they don't exist, which means you can't disprove them. And the response will always be, well, you just wait. They're like imaginary mice and shifts the crazy coot on the table screaming. But those mad ravings had us waiting for the stock market crash, a tyranny, World War III, IV, and V, all paranoid nightmares that never came. Instead, all we got were stock market highs, trade deals, dead terrorists, and jobs. And since those successes are under Trump, the delusions only deepen. Without a real vision beyond anger, they cling to these mental phantoms. Look, early on, we told the Dems impeachment was a dead fish. We said, don't follow Adam. He's selling you drugs that only end in bad trips. But did they listen? Nope. To them, bad drugs are better than no drugs, which is why they'll be back in the lab coming up with a new paranoia pill. But we know not to gulp them. Let them have them all, because we saw it coming, but they have it coming. All right, geez, where to start? Jesse, big fat waste of time. The only winner in this whole thing, us. The network is pulling in millions of eyeballs. Yes, God knows what the ad money is.
It's a lot. Well,
my second home is buying a third home.
Oh my God. Man, I don't even have a second home.
I have a fourth home on top of my third home.
Okay, I mean, stop bragging, damn it. I'm really jealous.
My sixth home is dating my seventh home.
Okay, well, when I'm your age, maybe I'll have a second home.
Oh, very good.
Juan, when I got on the set, you asked me, are you pumped? And I said, about what? And you said about the acquittal. And I thought to myself, we knew this was going to happen. This is like when your wife or your husband makes you go out to dinner to another couple's house who you hate. You have to go.
Right.
The food is terrible. You know you're going to have a bad time. Eventually, it's going to be over, and you're going to be back in bed, and you're going to say, I told you, honey.
Was that the one at my house?
Yes, it was. I think he's talking about the queso night.
It's like, and then just to say something, to have a Trump impeachment, and you don't have any sex. You don't even have a dead body. You don't have a suitcase full of cash in a freezer. This is the lamest impeachment ever. Also, to your point about what you said in the monologue, with these crazy predictions, it's the same thing with global warming. In 20 years, Miami's going to be underwater. And if you say, I don't think that's possible, they say, oh, ho, ho, you got to believe me. And by the way, you got to give me all your money. That's the same thing. It's a stick-up scam. I didn't fall for it because I told you the whole time what was going to happen. You didn't listen, Juan. Are you happy, Juan? Are you happy? Because it looks like it backfired.
Why do you say it backfired?
I'm just saying because Biden got damaged.
Oh, yeah.
You're not going to retake the Senate. Trump's at 49% approval. And what did we learn? There was a phone call, and the transcripts came out. I learned I was right.
We learned
But I knew that beforehand.
Well, you're always right.
Thank you.
But I will say, I think impeachment led most of the American people now to understand that this is a corrupt president. But they said, in essence, and this was the Republican line, even if he did it, we don't think it's quite impeachable. Wait till the election, as if the forefathers didn't think about elections. So you have now, I'm just going to give you a few, Senator Rubio, Senator Portman, Senator Toomey, Senator Collins, Senator Murkowski, and of course, Senator Romney, who voted to convict, all saying the president did something wrong, embarrassing, inappropriate, all of this.
But we saw that trick there, Juan. You just grouped Romney with people who didn't vote to impeach.
No, well, I'm just telling you, that's what they said. They said that the House managers made a convincing case, but we're not going to convict. I mean, I think Romney should be honored as a man of principle in this case, because at least he voted with his heart, not about retaining power or avoiding Trump's tweets. I mean, to me, what you get here is this is what Republicans in the Senate had to say. And then they, you know what? They just said, fold. You know, boy, we don't want Donald Trump saying nasty things about us.
That's good mind reading. That's what we're all thinking. Katie, what do you think?
Well, I was a little bit surprised at the vote with Joe Manchin. I thought he would maybe vote to acquit the president on at least one of the articles, considering in West Virginia the president is very popular and it would have been politically safe for him to do so, but he voted with Democrats. This was predicted as a bipartisan acquittal. It did not end up being that way, but there's obviously going to be a lot made of Mitt Romney's vote. I don't think that it really matters because the president has a 95% approval in the GOP. The American people have given him an approval rating at the highest that he's seen throughout his presidency. Throughout the trial, Adam Schiff is trying to say that he's going to cheat and steal, and that you can't trust the American people to make decisions in the next election. I think people probably took that pretty personally. And so moving forward, I don't think that his vote really matters when it comes to the numbers. And the president has had a lot of wins. And as soon as Mitt Romney does something that Democrats disapprove of, he will no longer be the moral clarity that they're claiming today. And I'd like to go back to the election against Barack Obama when they were calling him a racist, they were calling him an animal abuser, and of course he was waging a war on women. So, maybe some of those people can take back some of the things that they said about him at that point.
Yeah, the women in the binders.
Yeah, the binders full of women.
Dana, I wonder if you have thoughts on Democratic fatalism.
Well, I think that partly, Pelosi. Did you write that down or no?
No, I saw the.
I haven't even read this article yet. That was written by John Ellis. I'm sure it's very good. Nancy Pelosi was also telling them for months, don't do this. It's going to backfire. It's not a good idea. But she did feel pushed by the progressives.
Right.
And where else do you see being pushed by progressives? Well, you could look at after 2016. What did Bernie Sanders do? He got the DNC to change everything, and how's that working out for them?
Yeah.
And so I think her frustration last night was not only just at the president, but also at her caucus.
Mm-hmm.
Like looking at them thinking, I told you this was going to happen, and now they're in a fix.
Yeah.
And the president looks like he's just going to waltz right back into the White House for a second term. Obviously, it's not going to be that easy, but right now it feels that way.
Yeah, it hasn't gotten any worse for him, and it's gotten better since then. I think we have some sound on tape of Mitch McConnell smiling.
Speaker of the House says she refuses to accept this acquittal. Whatever that means. Perhaps she will tear up the verdict like she tore up the State of the Union address. There is no sign this attack on our institutions will end here. Whatever policy differences we may have, we should all agree this is precisely the kind of recklessness the Senate was created to stop.
What do you make of that, Jesse?
Well, I think he did a very good job as majority leader in the Senate, and he deserves a lot of credit for guiding this through. I think that Nancy tried to bully him, and Mitch McConnell's not a man to be bullied, and that's very clear. This was not a close vote. They were 20 votes short of conviction. It's not even in the realm of possibility.
It was a partisan vote, which is the whole point of the 2/3.
They needed 67. They got 20 votes less than that. And you look at the Mueller investigation and now this impeachment trial, Trump's clean. Trump is an innocent man. He has been found guilty of 0 crimes. And Juan, you said now that the American people are completely convinced this is a corrupt president. I would say this. I think the American people aren't going to believe any accusation by the Democrats against the president anymore, especially if it comes from an anonymous intelligence official, like the last 2 hoaxes have come from. And that's your fault, because you didn't do it in the sunlight. You did it behind closed doors, and that's not the way you take out the president.
Well, you can keep arguing the process. I think the reason I asked you if you were pumped was the man basically has got away with it. This is the man on Fifth Avenue shooting someone as he bragged, and his followers saying nothing. And after Mueller, where there was all this evidence again, he says, I was exonerated. It's unbelievable. And we can expect to hear that. I hear he's going to give a statement tomorrow. I expect he'll do that, and he'll play to the base again. But I just I want to finish here.
Okay,
he says basically what Republicans said today is Donald Trump, if you want to do this again, if you want to reach out to the Russians, to the Chinese, if you want to blame the Ukrainians for 26, do whatever you want, because you, Donald Trump, you know the best term I heard today?
What's that?
Dershowitzian, which is basically this.
Dershowitzian.
I was like, what? Dershowitzian, which means that anytime the president acts, as long as he thinks it helps his election and he thinks his election is the best interest of the country, it's okay.
But that's a misrepresentation.
That's no misrepresentation. That's a fact, Jack. That's what Alan Dershowitz said.
It's a complete
Go read the quote.
I did.
You know what
we
the
actually
president
talked
would
about
say?
this on the show.
You know what the president says? Read the transcript.
Yeah, no, I read it. What Alan Dershowitz said That if it's in the interest of the country, then it obviously helps him in re-election.
Yeah, because Donald Trump.
That's easy.
Because you got to re-elect Donald Trump.
No,
he says.
See, you're adding that. You're mind reading. You're adding a second part.
That's what he said. He said if the president believes his re-election is the best interest of the country, whatever he does, fine, go for it, Donald Trump.
If you are investigating corruption, or if you're trying to make a Middle East peace deal, that will actually help. If it just happens to help you get elected, that doesn't negate it.
It's called a mixed motive. But let me just ask Juan a quick question, because I really want to hear his answer.
Okay.
Is Trump innocent until proven guilty?
Everybody's innocent until
Thank you.
Guilty.